There. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Humanist Canada's webinar series. I'm Martin Frith on the board of Humanist Canada and your host today. And as our last participants are signing on, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items with you. Now, the first is that this is a webinar, so you're attending in listen-only mode. You will have an opportunity through the Q&A box to ask questions. And then we will also have a couple of polls for you to participate early in the webinar. Now, if you haven't already, I'd suggest that you take a moment just to check your audio settings to make sure they're set best for you. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a hand tool. And if you would wanted to raise your hands and if you can hear me, just to let me know. Now, today's webinar, okay, I can see the hands coming in. Perfect. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes in length, and there'll be a time allotted for some Q&A at the end. And Alice may invite us if there are questions along the way. And so you could submit those. Now, before I introduce our speaker, let me take a moment just to add some context. It was in March of 2019 that the government of Quebec Premier Francis Legault, the founding leader of the center-right coalition Action Democratique, passed an act respecting the laicity of the state, which is known as Bill 21. Now, Bill 21 prohibits certain public servants in positions of authority, including judges, police officers, government lawyers, principals and vice principals, as well as elementary and high school teachers, from wearing religious symbols such as a hijab, crucifix, turban, or kippah while on the job. Now, one of the reasons why we're hosting this webinar is that this law has polarized public opinion. The detractors of Bill 21 claim that it fuels anti-religious sentiment and it disproportionately affects Muslim women and restricts the freedom of conscience and is therefore unconstitutional. Now, the supporters of Bill 21 argue that it enforces the healthy separation of state and religion, that it prevents passive proselytism and enhances gender equality by freeing women from the constraints of oppressive religions. So wherever you fit on this spectrum, and we'll poll you in a moment, but over these next 4 weeks, our goal is really to create some dialogue and understanding on this important issue. So today, our topic is Bill 21, Understanding Different Sides of the Tension. We're delighted to have as our presenter, Dr. Alice Chan. She's the executive director and co-founder of the Center for Civic Religious Literacy, an organization that's just over a year old. Now, her research, professional and personal experiences have pushed her to see the importance of fostering understanding among religious, spiritual, and non-religious people, and the implications of a lack of understanding. Dr. Chan grew up in Ontario, engages with partners across Canada, and has lived for the last 4 years in Montreal. So this wide lens and her research on religious bullying help her to understand the tensions around Bill 21, which she'll bring to this webinar. So, Alice, we welcome you and look forward to leading us through this interesting issue.
Thank you, Martin, for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to talk about this contentious issue. And then also, thank you all for joining the call today to be part of the discussion. I'm really happy to talk about this because it is difficult. A lot of times when we talk about Bill 21, individuals kind of state their stance and then back off. And I think it's important to engage in dialogue to understand each other, because we live together. We don't have to agree on everything, but we need to understand where people are coming from so we can live, work, and engage better together, which is essentially what our center does. So for our conversation today, how I'm thinking of framing the conversation is, let me just introduce myself to you, where I'm coming from in this conversation, and then we'll kind of break down the different sides and take a step back, and at the same time take a step forward to see, okay, what now, now that Bill 21 is in practice. So as Martin introduced, we are the Center for Civic Religious Literacy, a non-religious nonprofit, and we started about a year ago. And our focus is really to help people understand religious, spiritual, and non-religious identities, and as I mentioned, how to work, live, and engage better together across many sectors of Canada. So our work really, I think we find it's important to localize our conversation, because anything related to religion, spirituality, or non-religious kind of changes depending on your geography and the history and the culture of each of the provinces across Canada. So this is our team. There's 9 of us here, and then one IT guy who doesn't like to have his photo shared, so he's not listed. But we're a team of 10, and we work across 4 provinces. We bring our teaching perspective. All of us have taught in various levels of education, and then that actually led us to our research. So together we're teacher researchers, and we bring that to any work that we do, whether it's teaching, research, consulting, or program evaluation. And really, very much so, we think this conversation about religious literacy needs to be civic, again, so that we don't necessarily have to agree, but we understand so we can live together. And to do this, we engage many aspects of society, whether they're schools, public sector, or private sector, so that all aspects of society, all facets, can support one another and work together in this form of living together. So that's kind of very briefly about my team and who we are. Please, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them later. But myself, what I'm bringing to the conversation today, as Martin mentioned, is I do live in Montreal now. It's been 6 years, and I moved here to do my PhD, and that informs part of my understanding of Bill 21 and what it's like to be a Montrealer, but then also a Quebecer. But that, alongside that, is the reality that I wasn't born in Canada. I grew up just outside of Toronto, and how does that understanding of being somebody who, just traveled to Quebec, to travel to Montreal, so it was a beautiful, fun place to go. How does that understanding now, juxtaposed with my reality of living here, help me understand the culture here better, help me understand the voices that support Bill 21 better. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's what I'm going to bring to the conversation. And just to be very straightforward, because many people ask and we want to be honest in all of our work, I just want to clarify that we're here to share the understanding of the different sides of Bill 21, but as an organization, we do take the stance that we do not support Bill 21. And in that, we really look towards the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that, as we know, was established in response to the World Wars and the Holocaust. And from there, we understand that in Article 2, there is the protection of rights and freedoms for all without distinction of any kind, whether it's race, color, sex, language, religion, etc. So in addition to that, we look to Article 18 that protects the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, again, to all, whether they're alone or in community with others, or in public or in private, and how they manifest this religion, thought, or conscious belief. And on this basis, Article 23 is important to us because Bill 21 does speak to the professions of certain individuals based on their religious symbols. And Article 23 says, everyone has a right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Again, this protection should be given regardless of any distinction. So we keep this in mind in our work, but at the same time, the reality is we know that the UDHR is not accepted by every nation in the world. It doesn't guide their principles or policies, and realistically, so their laws and interpretations of these rights are a bit different. And the history of each place, the regional history, also influences the interpretations, and which kind of, in a sense, complicates things, which really relates to what we are discussing today, and how Bill 21 is complicated and it is very regional specific conversation. So in terms of what I hope to discuss today and the objectives, essentially I want to share some different perspectives to this conversation, the key concerns from both sides and some narratives related to these key concerns, and then challenges that lay ahead for us, and how considerations related to these challenges. And related to all these points, I have a few objectives that again relate to the work that we do, but I think relate to how we want to engage and break down some of these tensions that exist. So by offering what I will today, I hope to foster some degree of understanding, consideration, and listening of different perspectives, and then invite us to all wonder more about, okay, what is the implication of Bill 21, and how does it not, or does it help us engage more with those who live with us in our society? So in terms of different perspectives, many of you may be familiar with this already, but the Leger survey or group, they found that in September 2019, 63% of people in Quebec support Bill 21, 27% oppose, and 10% either don't know, they didn't decide yet, or they refuse to answer the survey. And breaking down the 63% a bit more to help us understand the nuances in this conversation, Leger also found that in Montreal, 54% of individuals supported and support Bill 21. In Quebec City, the support was 76%. In the rest of Quebec, it's also in the 70s with 73%. Among the Francophone community in the province, it was again in the 70s, 73%. Among the non-Francophone, 33% support Bill 21. So with this said, understanding how conversations kind of align in Quebec, who does this bill really affect? And here we can see this data is from the National Household Survey. Statistics Canada gathered this in 2011, so it is somewhat outdated. However, it's important to, or helpful to see that the majority of people in Quebec affiliate as being Christian, and the majority of this, over 90%, self-affiliate as being Catholic. And less than, or approximately 5% altogether are Sikh, Muslim, Jewish, some Hindu, and some Buddhists, or Hindus and Buddhists. And among this group, they are the ones who really wear overt religious symbols most often to express their identity and their beliefs. So again, this is 5%, and as you can see, apart from Christians, the next largest group in Quebec are the non-religious or no religious affiliation at 12%. So this is helpful to inform our conversation, to see who does this affect in terms of Bill 21, and the reality is it affects a minority of people, approximately 5% or maybe even less, because not all Sikh, not all Muslim, not all Jews or Hindus or Buddhists wear religious symbols. So it is less than 5% of the population. And just to clarify, the government gathers data on religion every 10 years. So the next comprehensive census data will be in 2021. So from this foundation, we can go towards, okay, that is Quebec today in terms of Bill 21 and the religious affiliations and makeup of the province. And related to Bill 21, what are the key concerns, specific key concerns, and some narratives? And to further consider this, there's some need to consider the theory versus lived experience. So the law, which may be ideal, and then what is the reality? And this will help us consider the different side, whether you support or oppose it, and then also perhaps listen to what people might be experiencing in their daily lives as a result of Bill 21. So in terms of support, as I mentioned, 63% of people in Quebec support Bill 21. Key concerns, as quoted there, which Martin also read out at the beginning of this introduction, was that yes, for many people, Bill 21 can enforce the healthy separation of state and religion. It does prevent passive proselytism. It can enhance gender equality by freeing women from the constraints of oppressive religions. In addition to this, something that I've come to learn, and it's kind of implicit in a lot of the conversation, sometimes explicit, but mostly implicit, is the reality that Quebec is a nation. It's a nation within the nation of Canada, and it's a nation with a distinct heritage and culture that is very different from other provinces, just as different provinces in Canada have different cultures than other provinces. But within the nation of Quebec is the distinct identity of a religious and linguistic and ethnic heritage. I say heritage very clearly because there is an understanding that Quebec as a nation, the cultural identity does change across time. But how does that change, and how do people perceive this cultural identity? It varies, and there's a lot of discussion about it. But regardless, there is a desire to recognize the nation within a nation and to preserve its identity, its distinctiveness. And what does this mean? So for many people, what this means today in Quebec is a recognition that there was a negative, very negative impact from the Catholic Church in Quebec on the province itself. So from 1630s to 1960s, so over 300 years, the Catholic Church in Quebec established a lot of the institutions in this province. But over a period of time, not only did they establish it, but in many senses, it dictated the politics as well as the economics and the media and education and family life of people in Quebec. And it raised constraints and also expectations. And in relation to women in particular, there was an expectation that a woman would, broadly speaking, really care for a family and would have a large family. So even if you go back one generation, many people in Quebec today have very large families because of the influence of the church and cultural heritage and identity at that time. And as a result, many were not encouraged to go into higher education. And this speaks directly to the need for people today to support Bill 21 in hopes of freeing women from the constraints of oppressive religions. And so for some who see those who wear the hijab, for example, or any kind of headscarf, there is a similar recognition of an imposition of one religion requiring women to wear the hijab or other headscarves. And so that is where the individuals who support Bill 21 come into this conversation in terms of hearkening back to the Catholic heritage that impacted Quebec and the reality that in 1960s, during the Quiet Revolution, a lot of individuals who were Catholic, who wore a lot of Christian symbols, were encouraged and asked and culturally required to remove their symbols. And so in one particular conversation I had with a woman, she said, back then, in many decades ago, we asked Christians to stop wearing their habits, stop wearing their big crosses, and they were able to do that. So they need to do that because, well, they see why they needed to do that now, and we are just doing the same for other women of other religions to help them along. So that is one stance that does exist, and in relation to this is a diversity in Quebec. Diversity in Quebec is changing mostly in the urban settings where the immigration that comes into Quebec is largely French speaking. And when you look at most French speaking countries in the world, a lot of them, especially in a lot of people from North Africa do come to, and other parts of Africa and other Caribbean islands and places around the world, they do come to Quebec because of their fluency in French. And many of these countries have Muslim majorities. So with that linguistic diversity comes a religious diversity. And they want to, again, going back to nation in the nation, many supporters want to protect the distinctiveness of the Quebec culture and identity. That goes to the next point, which is the reality that Quebec is the largest and last free French-speaking group in all of North America. So to protect this uniqueness, there are certain things that need to be done, and Bill 21 for many people is part of this solution. And in terms of rural versus urban, there is a reality, as I mentioned, that many people who do move to Quebec, they move into the urban settings. So for those who are in rural settings, they question, why are minority groups in urban areas dictating then what happens in the rest of Quebec? Why are we listening to them? And for us, Bill 21 makes sense. And so why are we listening to the minorities? Within this, there's a lot more detail, but these are the overarching key concerns. Some narratives that exist include, to support this include the fact that, there are other jobs available. What is the problem? These are only 4 jobs: teaching, law, judges, and police officers. So why can't you find other jobs? There are other things available. And then others feel that Bill 21 can fight radical Islamization, and this is supported by politicians as well as individuals who have moved from countries with extreme religious views. In one of the articles cited below, one CBC reporter purposely went out to speak with a lot of people from the Middle East and North Africa who have experienced very oppressive Muslim leaders. And so they very much support Bill 21 because they don't want to be oppressed again in the country that they've moved to, and they don't want a repeat of what they've experienced in the past. And to this, one gentleman, Homan Davoudi from Iran, said he grew up seeing women with headscarves of all kinds, and he felt guilty in that culture when he did see a woman's hair. And here in Canada, he's felt, realistically, he knows that there's nothing wrong with seeing a woman's hair. What is the problem? I don't want to promote and maintain that norm, because essentially there is nothing wrong. So that's his stance. And others in the conversation feel that Bill 21 is the beginning of more cultural protections. Again, going back to the nation in a nation. So it's a small step. It affects the minority. So let's keep on going to protect our identity. So those are some of the voices. One thing to consider in this conversation is that there are some individuals who bring perspectives from other countries to Quebec, and very similarly to how other provinces are bringing their perspectives into Quebec concerns as well. So I raise this to complicate the conversation, not necessarily using it as a measurement to disagree with the supporters, but to really bring in a sense an academic perspective to say, how are we really our arguments to support it, how are they grounded in the local conversation, and are you using another worldview to impose ideas on yet another worldview? So just wanted to highlight that. In terms of those who are opposed to it, there are 27% of people in the province who are opposed to it. And as mentioned by Martin as well, their concerns is that Bill 21 fuels anti-religious sentiment. It disproportionately affects Muslim women, and it restricts the freedom of conscience and is therefore unconstitutional. And going back to the graph of 2011 and how many people are Muslim in the province at that time, they are the largest minority group out of the Jewish, Sikh, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu groups that were listed. So in terms of those who do wear overt religious symbols, it is true that this Bill 21, just by population size, really does affect more Muslim women than others, just because it's the largest minority religious group that wears religious symbols in the province. And in terms of restricting freedom of conscience, it goes back to the need to express how the refraining of how you express your religion. And within these perspectives, these key concerns are the voices of individuals who can't find work. So some of you may be familiar with Amrit Kaur, who was in the newspapers a lot this summer in terms of being an individual who's sick, and she just graduated from Faculty of Education at McGill, and she was hoping to get a job here, but because of Bill 21, she has since moved to BC to find teaching job there. So she had to leave the province. In other stories, I've heard that Bill 21 has normalized hateful language and exclusionary behavior, where teachers have been segregated in the staff room because they wear the hijab, even though they already have the job, which the grandfathering clause protects those who already are employed in these positions. In the staff room, she is excluded. And this is just from a professional perspective. I've also heard stories where individuals are discriminated against in the metro, for example, or on the streets and elsewhere. And again, focusing on employment setting, there's a reality that the grandfathering clause, yes, it protects those who are already employed, but it actually refrains them from accepting transfers in the same company or the same school, and refrains them from being promoted. So it only protects them currently in their position right now. And it also, for those who oppose it, the English Montreal School Board has very outspokenly said, you know, we have our values, and our value is to allow teachers and students to express through their dress whatever. So by imposing your political values on our school values, there's another tension here. Where do we stand when you're imposing on us? And so a lot of this struggle, specifically around work, is affecting poor mental health and well-being, and raises concerns in terms of one's physical well-being related to employment and ability to take care of self and their family. So these are the perspectives, and I just want to take a few steps back to look at the bigger issue in society. It's important to look at individual cases, but what are the statistics in the whole society that inform Bill 21? So in 2015, the Montreal police, and it was the last time they officially published details on hate and bias-based crimes in the city. But in 2015, 46% of crimes that were reported were related to religion. And this was 2015. If we step back a bit more and look at the province as a whole, the Commission for the Rights of the Person and the Rights of Youth in Quebec were tasked to study Islamophobic and xenophobic hate crimes. And so within their data, they looked at data from Statistics Canada, and they found from 2008 to 2017, the rate of hate crimes has increased in Quebec. And the majority of these crimes are motivated by race, on the basis of race, ethnic origin, or religion. And particularly in 2017, they found that those who are targeted the most were racialized and religious minorities, primarily Muslim, Arab, Jewish people, and Black people. And when you consider, at least from our data before, the Muslim and Jewish community are less than 5% of the community within Quebec, but they make up 24 and 10% of the hate crimes that are perpetuated or perpetrated in the province. There's a disconnect. There's something wrong there when you look at this comparison. And when you look at more data in terms of the report, what they did was not only review existing data, but they interviewed about 86 respondents, participants across the province of Quebec. And among those 86, 3 people, or on average, each respondent said that they experienced 3 xenophobic or Islamophobic acts. And then 35% of these individuals had to change their lifestyle so they would stop suffering from these hate crimes. And then out of the crimes that were listed, or the acts that were listed, 78% of them were not reported. So this raises the need to understand, okay, there are statistics, there's individual stories, but what's still missing? If 78% were not reported, what's still out there that we're not aware of? And in relation again to employment, one individual in the report shared that, finally, one of the people who works there told me openly, "You are the best, but they will never hire you because of your headscarf." And this is one mention of one's religious Muslim expression and identity in relation to employment. In other studies that I've done, there's many more examples that speak to the same issue, where employment, there's been barriers to employment because of one's religious identity in the province. So with this said, what does this mean? If we look ahead, what does Bill 21 mean potentially for the province, and what should we consider as a result? How can how can we at the end of the day engage with people despite these challenges? So in terms of challenges, and this relates directly to my research, and I'm happy to talk more about it later on, but I'll keep it relatively brief for now. There is a reality of religious bullying being a challenge, an upcoming challenge as a result of Bill 21, whether it's reported or not. And this whole topic of religious bullying, I just want to step back and say, I came to this only because I was a public school teacher in the Toronto area, and it happened to my students. And as a public school teacher, I know that I have to address bullying, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what it was. So that's why I came into this conversation. And from my research, I found that religious bullying, despite the terminology, it's multifaceted. It can happen between or within religious groups. So it can be bullying between Protestants and Catholics, for example, and then across religions, so between Hindus and Muslims, and then between religious and non-religious groups or individuals, such as between Hindus and atheists, or the other way around. And what really makes this bullying, as with all forms of bullying, is whether it's a verbal, physical, social exclusion, or online exclusion, it's there's a power imbalance that's being perpetrated in the incident. The desire to put one less than the another, and this power imbalance is the key to recognizing bullying compared to other aspects of teasing or something that may not seem so discriminatory or harmful. And why is it harmful? Realistically, it's because there's many effects that lead to public health concern. And bullying, all types of bullying, lead to a public health concern, because the effects of bullying are many. As you can see here, it can lead to lower self-esteem, depression, sluggishness, poor appetite, for youth, poor academic performance and truancy, etc., etc. Many of us are familiar with these, but what we don't realize is that bullying is not just in a school among youth. It can be among adults, and it can be institutionalized. So for example, when I was doing my study, my PhD in the US, at that time, Trump was just elected, and at the beginning of his administration, he placed a Muslim ban on the entrance of those from Muslim majority countries. Many of you will remember. And in that sense, many people, we never use the word bullying for outside of school issues, but reality is that was an aspect of religious bullying because it was institutionalized at a higher level, but there was a power imbalance between created to refrain those who were Muslim, or even just simply from those Muslim majority countries, from entering from entering the US, even though many of them were already in the process or had been admitted through a process and eligible for entering the country. So this, in relation to Bill 21, is the reality that Bill 21 is an institutionalized form of power imbalance, to say because of what you wear and what you believe or what you choose to believe, you cannot have a job, although you may have graduated from the same school in Quebec as somebody who has the same credentials, same grades, whatnot, but because of how you dress, your religious symbols, you cannot have this job. And this power imbalance has been created between the government and the people, but also between employee and employers, so that the employer can can choose who to promote, or is restricted from who to promote, based on their religious symbols. And also among colleagues, the grandfathering clause has led to some power balance and segregation to, again, who can be promoted and who cannot. Related to this is the reality that these, as some people perceive Bill 21 as a bill promoting hate, we need to consider the effects of hate and what does that mean. From the report here from, again, the Commission of Human Rights and the Rights of Youth, they summarized all the themes and the analyze the narratives that people shared in their interviews. And the effects of hate here are listed, such as fear and anxiety, feelings of exclusion, isolation, depression, humiliation, fear for the future, and not just the future and well-being for themselves, but again for their family and for the generation of their children who have been born in this province. Frustration and weariness of the reality that many people were born in Quebec or worked hard and were admitted to come to this province. So some people might wonder, what have I done wrong? If I grew up a Quebecer, who am I? What does this mean now? And loss of confidence, perhaps in many aspects of themselves or the society, and then a desire to leave the situation. And I raise this as an important point in terms of effects of hate, because apart from my work on religious bullying, I also have done research to look at radicalization to violence and violent extremism. And although many people feel that Bill 21 can be a way to address radicalization to violence, these effects of hate are actually, in many cases, along with the lack of economic opportunity, various facets that lead people towards radicalization to violence. So it's kind of counterproductive for those who believe that Bill 21 can address Islamization. So those are the challenges, just a few. And one thing that I want to kind of conclude the chat, my part of the chat today, with is the consideration of religious literacy. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard of religious literacy before, but it is, in terms of literacy, it's similar to the ideas of financial literacy and media literacy. So the literacy as a set of skills, framework, and content, so that we can approach a topic and then analyze and understand it. So that's really what religious literacy is. And in Canada, we find it is part of a civic conversation to have this understanding, to again, civically live with people who agree or don't agree with us. And so that's where we're coming from. And so in terms of religious literacy, I encourage and invite people to consider as a way to help us understand the complexity behind the positions of Bill 21, and the history of Bill 21. And so let me unpack what religious literacy is very briefly. Essentially, it's a way to understand that religions are internally diverse. So for example, for this conversation among Muslims, there are women who choose to wear the hijab, chador, niqab, burqa for various reasons, and those who choose not to. Some are realistically imposed or oppressed to wear it because of their cultural background or their family expectations, and some are invited to consider not wearing it by their fathers. And I know a few examples of this personally from students that I've had in Quebec. And so the reality is, the religious literacy helps us understand how diverse individual perspectives are, even within a religion. And then externally, we understand that all religions are different from one another. There are similarities, but there are also differences, such as between Hinduism and Buddhism. And very importantly, we understand that religious literacy helps us see that religions change over time. They are non-static, and they change depending on the geographic locale, depending on the economic, the political, the social, cultural events that are happening in that geographic locale, and then also it influences all these aspects of society in turn. So it's a fluid relationship. And specifically in Canada, our center very much recognizes that part of this conversation is the non-religious spiritual and Indigenous spiritual groups that make this part of the conversation in the country. And very importantly, we recognize that all of these perspectives, whether it's religious, spiritual, or non-religious, all of these worldviews are very personal to people, and at the same time understood in different terms and lenses. Some people might refer to religious literacy or their religious identity. Some people might use the word cultural. In certain parts of Canada, especially Ontario, some people might use the word creed, where in the Ontario Human Rights Code, that's the word they use. They use creed to talk about the intersection of one's ethnic, religious, and perhaps national origin from different countries. So the intersections of all these aspects, creed for some people might be a better word. But really, why is this conversation important? And for us, we think it's important because it helps us step back to, again, related to this conversation, think about religious symbols. What are religious symbols? And what are they historically? What are their purposes? And for individuals, what are their purposes today? And we realize in many cases, religious symbols are a way to, yes, help people be distinct from another group, but distinct in a way to express who they are and their community and the choices that they've made, not necessarily in most cases to proselytize to another group. It's really an expression of who they are. And at the same time, it helps us step back and wonder the many aspects of really what is religion? What does it mean for a community, and what does it mean for an individual? In many cases, yes, a religion is purely cultural. It's doesn't help us, understand who we are. It's just the community we belong to. In some cases, it's institutional. This is what we do. This is how we do things in our country or in our community. And then in other senses, it's how people answer the big questions in life and the world. Questions like, what is the meaning of life? Who am I? How did everything come to be? These realistically are questions that everybody asks at a point in their life, and everybody comes to a different answer, depending on the journey, the time of their life, and other aspects. So with religious literacy, it raises questions to consider these aspects of the conversation and wonder, with respect to Bill 21, as an institutionalized form of addressing one whole group in society, or many different groups based on one aspect of who they are, is this the right way or the beneficial way to approach the need to protect another social culture? So a lot of this has to do with rights, but also understanding where people are coming from and the individual experience, and not just the blanketing of a generalization of the experiences of a whole group. So that's part of the conversation that religious literacy can bring. And in terms of religion, I know some people believe that, why bring religious literacy or religion into this conversation at all? The reality is a lot of people still believe that religion leads to war and conflict. And yes, it can be a component of that, but a study by the Institute for Economics and Peace in 2015, what they did is they analytically reviewed the largest and most recent conflicts in world history, and they analyzed it to answer these 5 big questions. And they found, in terms of question 1, is religion the main cause of conflict today? The answer is no. And it's actually multifaceted. A lot of it has to do with economics, actually. and multifaceted aspect of what leads to the conflicts today. Not that religion isn't part of the issue, but it is not the main one. So again, a multifaceted, very complex conversation to understand what removing religious symbols might mean for the society of Quebec. And in relation to religious literacy, I wanted to also bring up and encourage and invite you to look at more religious literacy resources that are out there. I want to save time for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I encourage you to and invite you to look at this. I'll share the slides later with Martin so that you can all, those who are on the call, have access to it and access to this link to consider this massive online open source course from Harvard to help you understand how to come to this conversation and increase your religious literacy. And then to conclude, I wanted to raise some questions to help us again think about perspective and perhaps reframe the conversation. And the questions are, how have you felt in the past moving to another place? Whether it's a home, a different house in the same community, or just a different neighborhood, different city, or different country. How have you felt? And in those circumstances, how have you tried or not to blend your own identity with that of the new place? And so in these questions, I'm just inviting you to consider perspective of the human experience. And with that, what commonalities of the human experience overall, by understanding them and considering them, how can those experiences help you engage with the other side of Bill 21? So with that, I thank you very much. I appreciate your feedback. Later on, there will be a survey sent out. So please, please feel free to share your comments there or email me directly. I'm happy to continue this conversation if you'd like. For our work, we're on social media and we have a bi-monthly e-newsletter. And to continue the conversation, I invite you to come back next week for Dr. Jack Jedwab's conversation on Bill 21 again. Thank you.
Alice, thank you so much for leading us in this conversation today. So what yes, you've given us lots to ponder. So let's, this is an opportunity for any of our participants to have, if they have questions that they'd like to pose. So once again, I'd ask you if you'd take a look at the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or it may be at the top of some of yours. And if there are questions that you're mulling, if you wanted to take a moment and to pose those. Now, I'm wondering, Alice, if you could comment. Just it's only been since March that that Bill 21 came into force, and on the short term right now, what have been the implications? I understand that there's, it's before the courts as well, but on the short term, what have been the implications that you've identified?
There's various implications, mainly in the workplaces and among the minority groups. So I briefly referenced just a few of the stories that I've heard of teachers who are affected by this bill, and daily in their classrooms they are, or not just their classrooms, but in their schools, among colleagues, they're segregated. Excuse me. Whereas in one particular story that I'm aware of, this individual in the school board has been working in this place for many years, but because of the bill, the collegial environment, the climate in the school has changed. So she is the only individual in her school who wears a hijab as a teacher, and she's just in the staff room just segregated. And that's just one example. I know of others, student teachers at McGill who have experienced similar things going into a school and teaching. Just very clear tension of, well, in one case, I believe a school asked the student to take her hijab off to be a student teacher at that school. Another, I think, was asked not to do their student teaching at that school. So those are minor ones, and not minor, but those are just a few, and they're in the teaching environment. I'm not, to be honest, as familiar with the legal environment and what that's like in firms. But I also know that in well, people have left the province. I wasn't the individual who spoke to some of the individuals, but who experienced harassment on the metro. But I know that Justice Femme, a group here in Montreal, has received numerous calls and reports of discrimination as a result of Bill 21 coming in, even as proposal, and then now as a result as established bill.
Okay. And in terms of legal challenges?
Yes. So in terms of legal challenges, there are four, three or four. Technically it was four, but right now the National Canadian Council of Muslims, they've challenged the 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 courts here in Quebec twice, but they've been rejected both times. So they're kind of sitting and waiting to see what to do next. But again, in terms of teaching, the English Montreal School Board is challenging the province to say again, this is our school system. How are you imposing this? Do you realize, based on all the research that's been happening for decades and across the world in terms of the diversity of teachers and why that's important for the future generation to see diversity among teachers? How can you put this in place? So that's another one.
Okay. Now, a question that has come in from Sharon is, what evidence is there of proselytizing?
That's a great question. I actually, from my research, proselytizing usually comes in the ethics and religious culture class, which is unique here in the province of Quebec. It's the only province that has mandatory religious literacy or religious education taught in public and private schools at all grade levels from a non-religious perspective. So although it's a non-religious perspective course, it has its history comes from it previously being a course that was confessional in its stance when Quebec had Catholic and Protestant school boards, which are now French and English school boards. And so in those classrooms, it's actually from the many anecdotes that I've heard, and nobody shared this with me per se, but from the anecdotes that I've heard, there are, not from my participants, but it's actually the Catholic teachers who have been teaching for generations and taught the previous version of the course before this came into its date today in 2008. So they continue to teach the confessional stance in many parts of the province. And that's the common understanding of proselytization that I'm aware of. But in terms of teachers who wear the hijab or the turban, I've actually, or the kippah, I haven't come across any of these stories. And perhaps it's because the population is very small, but to be honest, I really haven't heard any stories or read any research that mentions this from these minority groups.
Okay, so
I have a question. Sorry, go ahead, Martin.
go ahead, Anna.
I have a question for you, Alice. You mentioned that in terms of demographics, the majority of Quebec's population is religious, yet the majority supports Bill 21, which is secular in nature.
Yes.
Is a contradiction? Perhaps it's not, but shouldn't the religious majority support the right of public employees to wear religious symbols? And if it's not a contradiction, what does this tell us about the nature of religious beliefs, I guess? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, that's a great question. And the reality is affiliation, religious affiliation, means many things to different people. In Quebec, there is a common practice of or reality, not just practice, the reality that many people are nominally Catholic because their parents are Catholic, and they come from Catholic. The identity of Quebec has a Catholic heritage, so they very much adopt this aspect to their identity. But in expression, of this Catholic identity. They may not go to Mass, they may not live according to certain tenets or practices of Catholicism, but they still feel that, you know, being Catholic is very important to them. That's who they are. And so that's where the disconnect comes in the data and the different perspectives. A lot of people might say that they're Catholic and culturally, but then in terms of how that comes into practice, greatly differs across the province. And that's something we see also with various different minority religious groups too. How some people choose to be Sikh, choose to be Hindu, and how they express that differs greatly. So that's, again, also with Muslims too. Do they choose to wear a headscarf? Do they not? And what does this mean for them? And are they Muslim in affiliation because of their community, because of their behavior, or because of their belief? This varies greatly across the province. So hopefully that answers your question.
We have one last question here. Is it possible to articulate a humanist perspective on Bill 21? Separation of religion from civic affairs is a popular humanist stance, but humanists also support individual human rights. And so that seems to be the reflection, you know, in the midst of the larger humanist community, where while slightly more than 50 yes, well, it would be there's a slight majority of humanists that we polled of our own members who would not support Bill 21, but there's been a sizable percentage of folks that do.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful question, and again speaks to the nuances of perspective. So yeah, humanist philosophy and worldview and values speak to human rights, but then also the separation of church and state. And so while and many people, I think, regardless of their belief, religious or non, really based on history, value and see the need for separation of church and state. I think that the big question here is how. And Bill 21 is one way to do it, but is that based on these values that we all hold? How can it be put into place that protects human rights while protecting the need for a separation of church and state? So for those who support Bill 21, who are humanists, and again, across the board, regardless of your religious, non-religious affiliation, I think this speaks to the bringing in of our many perspectives in life, that, you know, our regional, geographic, personal histories really inform how we come to these conversations. And our experiences, maybe some individuals, maybe those who support it are largely from Quebec. So they have that understanding, as well as their humanist stance informing their choice to support Bill 21.
Well, Alice, you've this has been a rich hour that we've had with you, and it's that time we're going to need to wrap things up for today. And I think to get us started off in this series, what you've certainly has begun to highlight some of the complexity and the nuances and the layers to arriving at some kind of understanding and appreciation of the issues.
Thank you.
So on behalf of today's webinar team, I wanted to remind you that you will be getting a survey, and we'd ask you to complete that. It certainly will be very helpful feedback. And that next week, Jack Jedwab, president of the Canadian Institute for Identities and Migration and the Association of Canadian Studies, will be our presenter. And he has a PhD in Canadian history from Concordia, and his courses have covered the history of immigration in Quebec, ethnic minorities in Quebec, official language minorities in Canada, and public policy and sports in Canada. So he'll bring another interesting perspective on this conversation. So on behalf of our webinar team today, myself, Martin Frith, Anna Popovich, Dr. Alice Chen, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to having you back next Sunday, January 19th at 3 p.m. to continue the conversation. So have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you once again, Dr. Chen.
Thank you.